I'm going to show you how to clean your mats, keep them as clean as possible, and give you a few tips along the way. Let's start by cleaning the mat. I prefer to just use a regular old baby wipe. I give the mat a really thorough good old scrubbing, but I only use my finger in the baby wipe rather than my nail, as it's important not to actually remove any of the sticky stuff. We just want to clean the mucky bits on top. This doesn't really take too long at all depending on the state of your mat, and once cleaned you want to let your mat dry out. It took about 5 to 10 minutes to dry, but I found if I leave it longer, like overnight, it ends up being stickier. While your mat is drying and you are kind of bored, you can get your protective cover ready. The cover that comes with the mat is there to protect it. I am lucky that I'm a bit of a hoarder and didn't actually throw it out when I bought my mats. The only thing I found is that I keep putting the cover on a different way round each time, and it doesn't really keep the mat sticky this way. Mostly because one side always ends up face down on something else while I'm using the mat, and one side ends up face up and that side is clean, but because I never know which side is going on the mat, it doesn't really stay clean. So I decided to pop some vinyl on the front of the protective covers, so I always know which way round to put it on. I decided to have a different slogan for each mat as well, so that I knew which cover went with which mat. I went into Design Space and added a different text box for each phrase. My green mat says T then Cricut because that's the one I use the most and T is always important to me. I then chose Softly Softly Scrapey Scrapey for the blue mat, as I always end up scraping hard off the blue mat and have to go gently so I don't rip up the mat. I then chose Let's Get Ready to Craft for my purple mat, as they tend to be my hardest crafts and newer materials for me to use. Ideally I would have rhymed rumble with something craft related so it actually made sense, but rumble and craft is crumble and that didn't quite make sense. Now these phrases aren't the best, I know, but they work for me. I've read that a few people use N and O to spell on when it's the right way round, but then would also spell no when the cover is the wrong way round. But I do just like a silly phrase. Anyway, I decided to use the same font and size for the text on all of the mat coverings so they all looked like they belonged together, and I went for BFC Autumn Harvest in a font size of 72. That does mean that each phrase comes up quite big, but I actually really like it that way. Once I had decided on my phrases, the font and the size, I then went to cut all the phrases. I used a mixture of smart vinyl that I could cut without the mat, as well as smart vinyl scraps that I cut on the mat. I also used a mixture of permanent and removable vinyl just simply because that's what I had in the right colours. Once cut, I weeded everything and got the covers ready for the vinyl. I chose which side to put up on the vinyl and cleaned it with a lint roller. If you do this, just make sure your lint roller isn't completely clean, because I find the cleaner the lint roller, the harder it is on the cover. So just be careful not to break the cover. They are pretty sturdy though. I used the lines on my green mat to line up the cover and pop masking tape to hold the cover down, and also used masking tape to help me figure out where the spacing would be for the vinyl. I attached transfer paper to the vinyl and then popped the vinyl onto the cover, scraped it down, and then took off the transfer paper. It all went swimmingly, although at some point I lost the T in craft, but luckily found it before it was too late. Once each cover had vinyl on them, I turned them over again and then lint rolled this side. So this would be the clean side that's then going to go against the mat. Once clean, I attached the protective cover to the mats. I know some people have trouble lining the cover up with the mat, but I tried to line up the triangle hole first and then the top sides, and usually this helps just to line the whole mat up. It usually works really well and relatively quickly. One tip I have here is to find a place to store your mats, whether that's temporary or permanent or both. I have a permanent storage space for my mats when I'm not crafting, but only recently sorted out a temporary storage. I use small little adhesive hooks to hang the mats on and have one next to the table I craft on so that I have all the mats near me when I'm crafting, but most importantly can have somewhere to keep the covers so I don't have to put them on the floor, which, let's face it, is what I used to do. I also cut the adhesive on the hook down to make it smaller and fit in a small space. My next tip to keep your mat nicer for longer is to move your material around when using the mat. If you use the same spot on your mat every single time, you'll end up getting the same spot dirtier or less sticky, so the mat won't last as long in that particular spot. So the more you can rotate around the mat, the longer your mat will last. My next tip is to not over clean the mat. When you first get them, they're super sticky, and it feels like you need to make them that sticky again, but actually once that initial stick has worn off, that for me is the perfect amount of stickiness. I do find them much nicer to use when they're not too sticky. I also find that if you over clean the mat, they become less sticky. So I only tend to clean the mats when I absolutely have to. You can see that my blue and purple mats look like they need a really good clean, but they're actually really sticky. So I'm going to wait until my materials don't stick very well before cleaning them. Other things I've heard of but not yet needed to do is to use washing up liquid and water on a sponge to lightly clean the mats. If cleaning doesn't work and you are at a loose end, you can also add some sticky stuff to the mat. I haven't personally tried it yet, but if I do, I will let you know how that goes. Lastly, if you've come to the sad conclusion that you need to buy a new mat, you can of course buy a Cricut branded mat, but you might find different brands cheaper, especially if you do find you need to replace them often. My first mat needed to be cleaned less than 2 months after I first got it. How long did yours last?